Welcome back to Mastering 3D in Photoshop. My name is Kirk Nelson. This is now lesson number 7, which is post-process compositing. And this lesson wraps up the first chapter of this course. So here's where we last left our rendered scene in the image-based lighting lesson, which was the last lesson. Now in this lesson, we will take this and transform it into a much more realistic appearance. I will say that the steps required to do this are fairly lengthy, so I'm not going to show each and every click because it would take far too long, and most of it is rather tedious and routine type of functionality. First of all, it's best to switch back over to the Essentials workspace so we can see all of our layers and access them when we need to. Now we'll go back to where we left the file last time in lesson 6, and we've got the 3D model rendered out. Now at this point, if we move anything within the 3D view, we will undo that render and we'll have to wait for it to render again. So what I like to do is to actually make a copy of this 3D layer, then hide the original one and rasterize this copy by right-clicking on it, rasterize 3D. So what that does is make sure that I've kind of solidified that rendered information. Now as we look closer at this rendered area, we can see that it doesn't really look like it's part of this scene. It almost looks like it's a little toy. And so let's walk through the different approaches that I took in compositing this to make it look more realistic. The first thing I did is convert this to a smart object. And then I noticed that the model itself looked a little bit smooth in comparison to the surroundings, so I used the Smart Sharpen filter. I've got that amount dialed up to 262 with the radius of 0.9. And you can see how that brings out a lot of the details that were kind of obscured previously. And then I added a hue saturation adjustment layer with the saturation dialed down to -12 and the lightness at -32 in an attempt to help match the lighting and the brightness of the surrounding area. And then I added a reflection layer, which is really just a copy of that background image. I've changed it to soft light and reduced the opacity to 58%. And if I turn it back to normal, you can see where I've positioned it. I've skewed it to look like it's in line with the side of the vehicle. And then I used a layer mask to mask out the reflection so it doesn't look like the tires are a reflective surface. After that, I added a curves adjustment layer and another attempt to try to match up the lighting with the surrounding area. Now these next group of layers are all created by hand. First it's the highlights, which I just took a copy of the rendered Jeep. I desaturated it, increased the contrast dramatically. In fact, if I turn this to normal, you can see what the contrast looks like. And I used the levels command to create that deep contrast like that, mostly just so I can get the very bright areas so that I can set this to screen and it really pops the highlights of the vehicle. And I have that opacity set to 95%. Then I made a selection of the window areas and filled it with a darker color set to multiply with about a midway opacity. After that, I added reflections to all the window areas and the fenders too. Now that's using the exact same technique that I used to create this base reflection on the side of the vehicle. But in this case, I have it constrained just to the windows and the fender areas. And then I painted in a window flare, just using a soft brush so it looks like that sparkle you get from the sun when it hits a pane of glass. I created selections of all the light areas so that those headlights and the floodlights on the top of the vehicle look like they've got some bright spots in the middle of them. And those are mostly just selections filled with a light gray and then smudged a little bit with the brush to give some variation to the coloring within it. Then touched up the highlights a little bit with a darker brush because I knocked them down a little. I thought they were a little bit too hot in certain areas. And then added a running highlight along the side of the vehicle, this side panel highlight here. That's set to screen, a low opacity of about 36%, and that's mostly just using a linear gradient, just going down to give a long running highlight along the side of the vehicle. Now notice each of these layers are clipped to that original smart filter layer so that they're being defined as far as where the pixels are visible by the Jeep Copy smart object. So next I added some distortion into the reflections. You can see as I reveal those there. And the way I did that is actually a kind of clever technique. I first added a blank layer, create a rectangular selection, go to Filter, Render, Clouds, then Filter, Filter Gallery, and you're looking for the Sketch Chrome. And you'll want a high degree of smoothness, high degree of detail, and it creates this very twisted appearance type here. Then increase the contrast on that with a levels command. And then I made subsequent copies of that and transformed them into place to fit over the reflective chrome areas and also a little bit on the roof. I set the blending modes to overlay and then decreased the opacity where it was necessary to get these nice swirly reflections on the chrome areas of the vehicle. After that, I added a roof shading layer where I sort of tweaked the way the coloring and the fall off works of the roof specular there. A hood reflection. Now this is a key little detail that you'll see on real photographs of vehicles, but you rarely see on digital images of them. The roof is a reflective surface and it should be reflecting the windshield in this top line here. If we didn't have these floodlights along the top, this would be a really smooth arc across the hood. Then I added some roof bumps. The way I did that was with a square filled in with a mid-tone gray and then just black and white lines to look like there's these running bumps along the surface there. And then that was just set to overlay, reduce the opacity, and transformed into place using the distort transformation. So it looks like those bumps are running along the length of that rooftop. And then after that, I used some regular painting with the brushes to make the lights in the fender look a little more realistic by adding some details just in there with that. And then speaking of hand touch-ups, I added in a gleams layer where I just used some white paint on a soft brush and painted in some specific little highlight areas where I would expect the sun to be glinting off the metal of the vehicle. Now at this point, I was thinking that this is looking fairly good, but it still doesn't really look realistic. And one of the reasons it doesn't is kind of a technical reason. Because if you look at the image of the vehicle, it looks very smooth, the pixels look very tight, but on the background, there's some JPEG compression there. There's some nastiness, some artifacts from that digital image that we're missing on our vehicle. So in order for this to actually look like it's really in this scene, it needs to be able to match that JPEG compression. What I did at this point was to grab the entire stack of layers here for this Jeep and create a merged layer of all of them. So that's Control, Alt, E. That's Command Option E on the Macintosh. So then we have this Jeep merged, and we can actually hide the rest of these because we've got this all merged into a single layer. And then I copied that into its own new file. So I'm going to Control or Command click on that layer and copy that. So Edit, Copy, and go to File, New. And it automatically sizes it according to the clipboard. So that's what's copied into there. Before we paste though, I'm going to edit and fill this with 50% gray and then paste it in, edit, paste. From here, we're going to save this as a compressed JPEG. So File, Save As, and we'll change this to JPEG. You can see I've already got one here. I'm calling it Jeep Compressed. I'll call it Jeep Compressed 2, just so I don't overwrite that other file. And when we get to the JPEG options, pull this quality down. Make it like 4 or 5. Now you won't see a difference here, but if we close this file and then open up that one we just created, that Jeep Compressed 2, zoom in on that, you can see how there's some JPEG compression on that now. So that's going to match up a lot better with this background than the one that's currently here. So now we just need to drag this over and deposit it on top of our working file. Take out that selection, and this is the one with the compression. And we will clip it to the Jeep merged and move it into place. It should pop in fairly nicely. If it doesn't, a way to check is change the blending mode to difference. And if it's mostly black, that means you have it in the right spot. If you see some lines to it, that means it's not in the right spot yet. You have to keep nudging it around until those lines disappear. What we have now is some compression on the Jeep that matches with the background a lot better. And so after that, I added a bit of noise to the compressed file, a quick brightness contrast adjustment layer, and I used the auto button in that to help match up with the lighting on the surrounding area. I felt like the roof needed a little bit of a touch up with the gradient there as well as the hood. And then for an extra little effect, added an antenna with just a 1 pixel wide brush. And things are looking pretty good here. Another technique to help composite things into a background isn't always to adjust just the image. A lot of times, making some adjustments to the background will also help. In this case, I've added a smart sharpen to the background to help tweak some of those details, a curves layer on the background too to give it a little bit more contrast to help match up with the Jeep, and then a quick vignette using the lens correction filter on a white filled layer set to multiply and the opacity dialed down. So that ultimately we've got a fairly realistic composite of a 3D Jeep into a nice mountainous scene. I All right, so that's the end of lesson 7 and also the end of chapter 1. Now, I know I went through that quickly and there were a lot of steps in there, but they weren't difficult steps. Anything that I thought really needed some further explanation, I did pause and show you. And I think this underscores why using 3D in Photoshop is really so handy, because you're already there and have the other 2D compositing tools available to you. Now, if you imagine trying to do all those touch-ups that we did here on the 3D side and having to re-render each time, it would have taken forever.